You are standing on top of a medieval castle wall, and everything feels perfectly fine. Archers are stationed on either side of you. The storerooms below are packed with enough food to survive for months. The enemy army camped outside your gates has not launched a single serious attack in weeks. You are actually starting to believe you might survive this siege. But 60 feet beneath the exact spot where you are standing, a group of men has been crawling through a narrow tunnel for the last 3 weeks, heading straight for the foundations under your feet. In a few hours, everything you are standing on is going to collapse into the earth, and you will never even hear it coming.
This was the terrifying reality of siege warfare for hundreds of years. Everyone assumes the greatest danger to a castle was the army camped outside the walls, the one you could see, count, and prepare for. But the real threat was invisible. It was underground, moving silently towards you while you watched the horizon for an attack that would never come from that direction. To understand why this tactic became so feared, you first need to understand just how impossible it was to break a well-built castle from the outside.
A properly constructed stone fortress in the 12th or 13th century was a nightmare to crack open by force. Walls at places like the Tower of London or Château Gaillard in Normandy were anywhere from 8 to 20 feet thick at the base, built from solid cut stone with mortar that hardened almost like concrete. These walls were not even flat. Many had a sloped base called a battered plinth, engineered specifically so that anything thrown at them, rams, stones, even early cannon fire, would glance off at an angle instead of striking straight on. On top of that, defenders had every advantage. Archers fired from behind narrow slits without ever exposing themselves, and boiling liquid or heated sand could be poured through murder holes onto anyone foolish enough to reach the gate. Direct assault, in other words, was basically suicide. Starving a garrison out could work, but it took months, sometimes over a year, and the besieging army had to feed and shelter itself the entire time, often losing more men to disease in their own camp than the defenders lost to hunger. So military commanders needed a third option, something faster than starvation and safer than charging straight into arrow fire. The answer was to stop attacking the castle from the front entirely, and instead attack it from directly underneath, where no wall, no archer, and no boiling oil could reach you. The concept was brutally simple once you understood it. Miners would begin digging from a hidden position behind the siege lines, often concealed inside a tent or behind a wooden screen, so the defenders had no idea the work was happening at all. The tunnel itself only needed to be wide enough for one man to crawl through on his hands and knees while dragging baskets of loose dirt behind him. And these were not ordinary soldiers handed a shovel and told to start digging. Armies specifically recruited professional miners from the tin mines of Cornwall, the silver mines of Germany, and iron mines scattered across Central Europe. Men who understood soil, rock, and structural collapse better than any knight ever could. These men were paid far more than regular troops, and they earned every coin of it. Tunnels collapsed without warning. Men suffocated from bad air trapped deep underground. Flooding could fill a shaft in minutes, with no way to escape. The danger was constant, and it often killed miners before the enemy even realized digging was taking place. Once the tunnel reached the castle's foundations, the real work began. Miners would carve out a wide chamber directly beneath the wall, propping the ceiling up with heavy wooden beams so the structure above stayed standing, at least for the moment, held up entirely by timber instead of solid earth. When that chamber was large enough, The miners packed it with anything that would burn fast and hot: brushwood, dry timber, and most famously, animal fat. Then they lit it and ran. As the fire consumed the wooden supports one by one, the wall above lost everything holding it up, and it did not simply crack. It dropped straight down into the void that had been dug beneath it, sometimes taking an entire section of the fortification with it, tearing open a breach that the waiting army could pour through. This is exactly what happened at Rochester Castle in 1215, during one of the most dramatic sieges in English history. King John was furious that rebel barons had seized Rochester Castle, a fortress with walls over 12 feet thick and a keep standing more than 100 feet tall. He tried everything first. 5 stone-throwing catapults battered the walls day and night. Infantry attempted to storm the outer defenses. None of it worked, because the walls were simply too thick and the defenders too well protected. So John called in his sappers, who tunneled beneath the southeast corner of the great keep for weeks. When the tunnel was finished, John sent an unusual order to his officials, demanding 40 of the fattest pigs in the land, not to feed his army, but to render their fat and pack it into the mine to fuel the fire. The corner of the keep collapsed exactly as planned, and if you visit Rochester today, you can still see the evidence, because the rebuilt corner uses round towers instead of square ones, since builders realized square corners were far easier to bring down. Rochester was far from the only fortress brought to its knees by miners. When King Philip Augustus of France besieged Château Gaillard between 1203 and 1204, he faced Richard the Lionheart's masterpiece, a fortress so expensive and so cleverly designed that Richard once boasted he could hold it even if its walls were made of butter. Mining cracked the outer defenses over a brutal winter siege, while a separate group of soldiers famously climbed up through an unguarded latrine drain to breach the middle section of the castle. Between the tunnels and the sewage pipe, one of the most expensive fortresses ever built fell, and with it, England lost the entire region of Normandy to France. Naturally, the defenders inside these castles were not willing to simply wait for the ground to give way beneath them. They developed an entire arsenal of countermining techniques, and some of them were genuinely brutal. The first challenge was simply detecting a tunnel in the first place, since digging sound rarely travels far through solid earth. So garrisons got creative, placing drums or copper bowls filled with water along the base of the walls and watching for the faintest tremor on the surface. Some even balanced dried peas or small bells on the inside of helmets pressed against the ground, so any underground movement would make them rattle. Some castles took the threat so seriously, they built permanent listening tunnels directly into their walls, giving defenders a head start the moment enemy digging began nearby. Once defenders located an enemy tunnel, they dug their own shaft to intercept it, and this turned the underground war into something close to hell itself. Picture crawling through a pitch-black tunnel, barely wide enough for your shoulders, hearing tools scraping somewhere ahead, knowing that any moment you could break through into enemy territory and end up fighting hand-to-hand in total darkness, in a space too tight to even swing a sword. Men fought with daggers, hammers, and bare hands, because full armor was useless in a passage 4 feet high. When face-to-face combat wasn't an option, defenders turned to flooding tunnels with water, which meant certain death for anyone trapped inside, or pumping smoke into enemy passages using bellows, forcing miners to either suffocate or abandon weeks of brutal labor and flee to the surface. Some of the most advanced countermining in history took place not in Europe, but in the Middle East during the Crusades. The fortress of Crac de Chevaliers in modern Syria had foundations sunk directly into solid rock, making tunneling beneath it nearly impossible, while a sloped stone apron forced attackers to begin digging much farther away, buying defenders extra time. At the castle of Margat in 1285, Mamluk miners and Crusader defenders dug tunnels so close to each other that both sides could hear digging through the rock. Rather than risk a bloody underground collision, the Mamluk commander simply invited the garrison to inspect the mine themselves. When the defenders saw how close their tower was to collapsing, they surrendered without a single explosion, which might be one of the most effective psychological plays in the entire history of siege warfare.
Everything changed once gunpowder became widely available in the 14th and 15th centuries. Miners no longer needed to burn out wooden supports and wait for a gradual collapse. They could simply pack a chamber with barrels of powder, light a fuse, and blow the wall into the sky in one single explosion. By the era of French military engineer Vauban in the 17th century, siege mining had become an actual science, complete with calculated gunpowder amounts and predictable timelines for breaching a wall of any given thickness. This approach reached one of its most dramatic moments at the Siege of Turin in 1706, when Italian defender Pietro Mica reportedly lit a charge and sacrificed his own life to collapse a tunnel on advancing French miners, saving the citadel and becoming a national hero remembered in Turin to this day.
14. What makes this story so remarkable is how long it survived past the medieval era most people associate it with. During the American Civil War, Union soldiers dug a tunnel over 500 feet long beneath Confederate lines at Petersburg, packing the end with 4 tons of gunpowder and blowing a crater 170 feet long into the earth. And decades later, during the First World War, tunneling companies from Britain, France, Germany, Australia, and Canada waged an entire secret war beneath the trenches of the Western Front, using canaries to detect poison gas and racing to dig faster than the enemy tunneling toward them in the dark. The largest mining operation in history came at the Battle of Messines Ridge in 1917, when 19 mines packed beneath German positions were detonated almost simultaneously in an explosion so massive it was reportedly heard in London, killing an estimated 10,000 soldiers in seconds.
From pig fat and burning timber to tons of industrial explosive, the technology changed almost beyond recognition over nearly 1,000 years. But the core idea behind it never did. If you cannot break through the walls in front of you, you go beneath them instead. Every commander who ordered a mine dug was placing an enormous bet, betting that his engineers could work faster and quieter than the enemy's, that the ground would hold, that the air would last, and that the men crawling through total darkness toward an uncertain end would not lose their nerve before the job was finished. So the next time you stand in front of a medieval castle and admire the thickness of its walls, take a moment to look down at the ground beneath your feet. Because for centuries, the real war was never fought on top of those walls at all. It was fought in complete silence, in complete darkness, far below them.